Okay, it's 1 o'clock. Welcome to this week's HDF clinic. I saw a few questions in the Google document, but then there might be other questions. So what I propose we do is we quickly go over the questions that I saw in the Google document, and my apologies if you just added another question 10 minutes ago. I have other things to do during the day rather than constantly watching that Google document, but that's what I saw this morning. Okay, and if there are other questions, we'll add them here in a moment. In case there aren't any other questions, I have a few things prepared that came up on the forum, and they are very interesting as well. So the questions that I saw in the Google document were around H5 R&D, and I can, if Stephen is here, he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I can sort of try to give you a first set of answers. The first question was about, so just for people who might be joining here for the first time or weren't here last week, Stephen Varga, one of our very active community members, wrote this tool called H5 R&D, and if you look in the notes later, there is a hyperlink here to this GitHub repository. That tool basically lets you specify parameters like the number of groups and the number of data sets, and then it will create a random structure that meets those criteria, and you can visualize the graph structure that was generated this way and generate an HDF5 file if you wish. And so related to that, as we all know, objects in an HDF5 file are referred to by path names. And so the first question related to that, since as this questioner here points out, the underlying mathematical algorithm actually uses sort of sequences or graphs labeled by integers. And the question is, well, how are the names actually produced for these objects? The good news is actually, since it's open source, the code is actually not very large. The code base at the moment, it's and if you know a little bit of C++, it's actually easy to pick up. Well, the way I believe Stephen has implemented it right now, it basically creates a pool of random strings that it uses as link names. And these link names are basically constructed. He picks the alphabet that consists of lowercase and uppercase Latin alphabet characters, lowercase a to z and uppercase capital A to capital Z. And he basically randomizes the length of these strings, and it's a uniform distribution over that length between 5. So we will have at least 5 character names up to 30 character names. And then it just reaches into that pool as it constructs the path names for these objects. So they are, for all intents and purposes, random strings over this restricted alphabet. The next question was, does it create multi-dimensional data set with a rich set of HDF data types, compound data types perhaps? No, it does not do that at the moment. From my reading, it creates one-dimensional 1000 element floating point 64 that is double data sets, and it puts an attribute on there. Could that be extended to arbitrary types? Yes, absolutely. Anything is possible. The question is really what's your budget, or if you would like, if somebody would like to contribute that code, they are more than welcome to do that. But yeah, so it's absolutely possible. But of course, at this point, there wasn't really a need and no budget for it. Next question: are named data types generated? If not, are these reasonable types of extent? Absolutely, they are. In fact, they could use the same general idea, because unlike the most general graph structures that you can represent in HDF5. For data types, we know that they have to be strictly nested sort of tree structures. And you could use the same kind of proof of sequences to generate these types. But no, not currently. Again, it's just a matter of interest and budget, and anything is possible. So that I hope if the person who asked this question is present, maybe there are follow-up questions. Otherwise, first question, are there other questions?
Gerd, yes, this is Robert. I did ask those questions on Stephen's random generator, and Stephen was good enough to post a nice sample of the generated output, and so I saw it. The question that I had was, does this push the bounds of the utility beyond what would be reasonably expected, or is the framework suitable so that these extensions could be made with, I would say, a reasonable effort? And does it fit nicely with the overall philosophy of the tool?
Can I take that one?
Oh yeah, Stephen, go ahead.
Hi, how are you doing? This is Stephen here. There are two components to this Lily tool. One of them is the prefer algorithm that does the random tree. And the other component is some way of providing the data sets and the names for it. Now, it turns out that this tool was not, it's backed with an infrastructure that I designed for the next generation of the H5CPP as a test framework. So the way that you see it at the moment is a backported version, a simpler version of a more complex infrastructure. And that limits how far this code, the way it is, should be developed further in terms of with the provided H5CPP library or respect to that one. Now, the interesting part, there are no changes required to actually make it work with the newer version of the H5CPP library, which is not public yet. So what's going to take place is the labeling. Probably that should be improved, and it can be improved in with few hours of work, possibly providing something like dictionaries from the user share dictionary words or some other languages. That's very easy to do. Now, as for the data sets, that's a more complicated question, and I already have a version for it. Like I have an infrastructure for this one, but not this version, but not for this version of the H5CPP. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yes, no, that sounds good. It sounds like then some of these things that are listed here, you've thought of, and it's really going to be in the next pass of this random generator. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's thought of in a very detailed way.
Okay.
In a sense that to do this for runtime is not so hard to do, and many other frameworks already can do this one. But I actually did something that able to do this at compile time with the Google test framework. So you can just query or ask at compile time some random parameters regarding type, sizes, and whatnot, and then you should be able to get a data set. What was missing is actually was the preferred tree.
Yes. Okay. Okay. All right. That sounds very good. So it seems like then the best solution is to wait and see what the next pass, rather than to jump in and try to make any of these extensions on my own. Is that correct too?
Right. If you want to make any extension or any changes, then I would say that you can relabel the random sequences to dictionaries, so they look better. It can improve on the visual, but technically it doesn't really help you much with when it comes to testing. So actually I have a more advanced version of this random string generator that gives you a lower upper bound and some distribution. That actually gives you something like, it gives you something like you can stress test the metadata service, see how it behaves.
Okay, that sounds very good. Thank you.
That's a very complex thing to do.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks for that reply. Other questions? Other questions? I know we started a little bit of a discussion near the end of the meeting last time. There was a gentleman that was talking about accessing HDF5 files over 40 gig Ethernet on an external drive, and he was asking whether he should try to compound all that into a single file or read them individually and so forth. So I don't know. I left some comments in the notes from last week, but we can, if there are no other questions immediately, I can talk about some of the forum issues, and then we can circle back and see if there are other questions. Okay. Unless somebody, unfortunately, I can't see you. So if you raise your hand, please speak up instead of raising your hand. And okay, then I will just go over some of the forum issues. One was relatively recent. Somebody posted a question having issues with accessing external links in parallel, and that seemed to be confined or limited to HDF 1.12.0. That in particular, the parallel access worked fine in the sort of 110x versions. And so that would be 1.10.7 at this point and up to 1.10.7. And it also worked fine in serial. However, there seemed to be an issue with 1.12.0, and only if you use the MPI-IO virtual file driver, and then so you are accessing a file, and there are data sets in there that are externally linked, so the actual data sets reside in another file, and that didn't work. And it appears from the response, I believe Elena or Barbara or both responded that, yeah, that was this was a known issue. It may have been reported by someone else, and it was now again spotted in the field. And the response that I saw, developers claimed that in the current development branch that was fixed, and they are waiting. They asked the user to confirm that, and I haven't seen a reply. Maybe there is one now, but so that's waiting for confirmation from the user that that's been fixed. And because I know in terms of our release cycle, I believe 1.12.1 would be the next release on the schedule, and it's important that the fix would be in there. That was one. Another one, unless there's a question, so maybe I'll just to be sure. Are there any questions about this issue or other questions in general? Okay. Then there was an interesting post from someone who seems to work with MPI for Pi. So those are the MPI bindings for Python and H5Pi. And he noticed that when, or he had debugged the issue to the point that, of course, H5I decrement reference is a function in the C API, and I'll explain briefly what it does. But he so has a Python script that uses parallel HDF5 that it hangs in H5I decrement reference. Now, the first thing I would say is, of course, he is not using that function himself directly because this is written in Python. And again, link to the post is included here if you want to read up on that. But the issue could be, he also provided a minimum working example. And but of course, I think what he has to be aware of also is that we as HDF group can only offer a limited amount of help, because we are not the neither the experts nor the maintainers of MPI4Pi or H5Pi. So I'm sure people will give you their honest opinion, but we are not really the experts on either of these modules. If he had provided a C or C++ minimum working example, then we could have helped him. But from just reading the Python code, I can see he's doing something odd there, at least from a parallel HDF5 perspective. For example, he opens, at some point he has this call where he opens the file on rank 0 in read-only mode, and he opens it in R+ in Python speak, which means, I believe, in C, read-write. And that is kind of a red herring, because all these collective operations, and this is really more of an MPI issue rather than an HDF5 issue, all these collective operations, all processes must call the same functions, and in the case of MPI file open, actually with the same literals down to the path name and also the access modes. So I find it, to me, it's sort of asking for trouble to have one rank where you open it with read only and other ranks open it with read write. Well, that's not going to be collective right there, because it violates the rules of MPI. And then the I decrement reference, that is actually an interesting function, but as I say here, it's a function that needs to be used with care. Is basically, as we know, HDF in a way assesses or determines if an object is in use by maintaining a reference count. And every time, for example, you create a hard link to an object like a data set or something like that, its reference count is incremented. The other way around, it gets decremented. You can decrement it intentionally by calling this H5 decrement ref function, but it also gets decremented as a side effect, for example, as by unlinking an object. If you unlink an object from a group, sort of removing the object from a group in double quotes, because it's really, as in a Unix file system, an unlink operation. If that reference count goes to 0, then the object is considered as its free space, it's available, and the space can be reclaimed or tracked. Or so that's why this is a rather dangerous function to use by hand, but it will get used as a side effect in implementations of all kinds of functions. Now, what could happen is, since this is a metadata operation, since he may believe that either he maybe isn't cognizant of the fact that this is a metadata operation too, and all these metadata operations that affect the file structure and so forth, they have to be collective with parallel HDF5. And so again, to me, this whole thing, it would be nice to see a C++ minimum working example, but to me, it looks as, yeah, he doesn't really operate collectively, and this cannot work the way it's written. But again, then who am I to say? I'm neither an MPI4Pi nor an H5Pi expert. I can just sort of surmise of, I mean, I know at the end of the day, MPI4Pi calls just the same MPI calls that we would call in a C program, and H5Pi calls the HDF5 API calls the same calls that we call. But there could be all kinds of things happening in between. So that's an interesting one, and we will see what he comes back with. Any other question at this point? Otherwise, I'll just continue. Okay. Another interesting post is someone commented that H5 Diff, this is sort of a command line tool that you can use when you have two HDF5 files and you would like to see, for example, for two given data sets, if there's any difference in their shape, in their type, but also if they have the same shape and type, if there are differences in values. But he noticed that, or he or she noticed that H5 Diff exits with 1, and the status code of 1 would indicate that there is a difference. I mean, the standard Unix diff tool returns 0 if there is no difference, and anything that's non-zero indicates either an error or that there is a difference. And it exits with an exit code of 1, but it doesn't really print any differences. And as it turns out, and I believe Elena replied, it is a case of out-of-date / poor documentation, in the sense that, yeah, there is a verbose option. Had he specified that, or I seem to recall that he pointed out that he also discovered that option, because if you turn on verbosity, it will actually tell you that in his case, I believe the two were actually structurally different, and that caused that return code. But since he hadn't turned on verbosity, he was not given that information immediately, and that contradicts the documentation. And I would also point out that H5 Diff is perhaps the most complex command line tool, because in a way it has morphed into this. I don't know what its original design goals were, or maybe its original design goals were more modest in the sense that you could really just compare two data sets. But it has sort of morphed into this. You have to do a multi-graph comparison, which is already a very non-trivial thing. And then you have to reason about what does it mean to be equal for two things structurally. But for example, if you have also two data sets of integers, one is 32-bit integers, let's say, and the other is 64-bit integers. Well, under what circumstances or what different definitions of equal could you have there? One definition of equal could be, well, if they aren't the same type, then they cannot possibly be equal. But then an equally valid, depending on what your goals are, you could define equality at the level of integers, where you would say, well, I don't really care about the specific sort of bit count representation, whether my integer 5 is represented as a 64-bit integer or as a 32 or 16-bit integer. I only care about the value as an integer. And that's perfectly fine. But then you have adopted a different version of equal. And the problem is, of course, there are many equally valid definitions of equal that you can adopt. And then, of course, you have to communicate that, if possible, to the tool somehow. But that, of course, goes back to illustrating that this is a very complex tool, and maybe it's a tool that has sort of grown too complex, and it might be better to refactor it and maybe have multiple tools or something like that. But then, of course, hand in hand with that goes outdated and poor documentation, and then bugs get fixed. But then, as these things go, writing the code is often the easy part, and we have to do better. Okay. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'll just keep on going. There were lots of interesting things on the forum. Okay. If there are no other questions, someone, and maybe this is one where I don't have too much to say, somebody asked about independent data sets for MPI processes and whether there was any progress on the scenario. the person described a little bit what he or she was after, although in my opinion that needed a little bit of clarification. But I believe where the person was coming from was to say they are acquiring data and from two sources, and I believe there was like a camera stream and another, I forgot already what the device type was, and there were different rates. So one acquired data at a relatively high rate, and another process in a logical sense at this point required data at a lower rate. And of course, in that situation, you don't want to necessarily couple the two, but I believe the underlying assumption was, well, I have an MPI program that does that somehow, and then as we know, and actually we talked about that when we talked about this Python example here, there is this issue of that any changes to the file in terms of creating new data sets, creating new groups, creating new attributes, and so forth, has to be a collective operation to guarantee that all the processes in that communicator have the same view of what's in the file. Because if you don't do that, once they diverge, that is just asking for trouble and problematic. And so the question was, there was some talk, I think the person made reference to a posting or to an earlier discussion where we talked about maybe relaxing that requirement of these operations to have to be performed collectively, because you can see here, since we have these different rates of data acquisition, you have, let's say, two extendable data sets. Of course, you would extend them by different increments at different rates, at different frequencies. And that is, of course, programmatically tricky because you might find yourself in a situation where, because it has to be collective, two processes will end up, or two groups of processes will end up waiting for each other. But then I believe Stephen also replied to that. And there are plenty of alternatives to do that. I think Stephen proposed an approach based on 0 and Q. Another approach would be to completely separate the two data sets in different files, and then basically have to come back to external links. We are sort of closing the circle. We are talking about very related topics here. To have basically a stub file in which you have external links to these data sets. And if you absolutely want a single file, you could then do a repack on that file with the external link. So there is nothing really new in the sense of relaxing that requirement for these operations to be collective, and that mostly comes from cache coherence. The only thing I can think of that is somewhat related is that in the sort of 1.12 family of releases, we have that this idea of asynchrony. There's a first set of operations that can now be performed in an asynchronous way, and that includes the creation of objects, that also includes the extension of data sets and things like that. But to my knowledge, there is no real relaxation or removal of this restriction of that operation, that it has to be collective, is not in the cards as far as I know. And I see we are almost out of time. There was one more interesting post from someone in the H5Py community, Tom. He was asking about, is writing to virtual data sets supported? So virtual data sets, the idea is you take multiple data sets and stitch them together and make them appear as this one large data set. And do we support writing to these? And as he points out, according to the specification, yes, we do. However, there appears to be an issue when that data set is, for example, a 64-bit integer data set, but the constituent data sets, or some of the constituent data sets, are 32-bit integers. and then there would be a data type conversion involved on the fly, and it appears that that is not happening. And so that's why it's broken. So nobody has replied yet, but yeah, I'm sure we will reply to that at some point. So that's where we are. Time is up. Thanks for coming. We'll have another one next week, and leave your questions in the Google Doc, or pick up on some of these on the forum. And thanks for coming.